Okay, welcome everybody. Great to have you here for our first public lecture. I'm very happy today. Yeah, please find a seat. There's plenty of chairs. So this is our first public event in our during our workshop on democratic economic planning, and for our public event we have Cédric Durand here. It's a pleasure for me to have him here. Cédric is associate professor at University of Geneva in Switzerland. He is a Marxist political economist, I would say, a regulation school most famously. And he, for those who don't know him, he was publishing 3 very interesting books that I would recommend. One on fictitious capital a few years ago, one on techno-feudalisme, which is translated to English now, techno-feudalism, and the most recent book, which is interesting for us from the perspective of social-ecological economics, is of course the book on planning. It's with Rasmik Keucheyan, Comment bifurquer les principes de la planification écologique. And it's not translated yet. We hope to get it translated soon. And yeah, Cédric contributed frequently to the New Left Review, published several peer-reviewed journal articles, and we are very much looking forward to his presentation today. So welcome all, Cédric.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Manuel, for this very kind introduction. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. This workshop is fantastic. A lot of great topics and a lot of conversations that we already had within the workshop today will resonate in my lectures tonight. So I will talk about ecological planning and the problem of knowledge in the Anthropocene. And since I'm in Vienna, there will be a lot of things about Austria or Austrian maybe, and you know that's complicated, Austrian in economics. So that's the kind of issue that we have now. Why? Because I'm not sure that I know how it works. Yes, because Austrians won. That's what we were told. This is a paper by Brad DeLong that was written in the late 90s when he was discussing the book by James Scott, Think Like a State. And James Scott is a kind of anarchist, scholar, anthropologist that explained that there is a problem with knowledge in economics. And what Brad DeLong says is that basically James Scott was just repeating the Austrian argument. And this argument that James Scott was repeating was for Brad DeLong something that was obvious, something that was in fact acknowledged by all economists. What wrote DeLong at that moment is that within economics, even liberal Keynesian social democrats acknowledged that Austrian won. Bravo, Austria. And they won their battle against central planners. And James Scott made the victory even stronger because he said that the victory was not only now among economists, but also among sociologists, political scientists, and anthropologists. And the argument of Scott, which is a very Austrian argument, is that the necessarily seen schematic model of social organization and production animating the planning was inadequate as a set of institutions for creating a successful social order. And what I will try to demonstrate tonight is that basically we conceded too much to the Austrian. They had a point, but we conceded to them too much. In the age of the Anthropocene, the knowledge problem is, of course, very acute. We know that we are crossing all the boundaries, and we can think of that problem as a problem of loss of mastery. This is the way William Capp framed the problem. The current transformation of the environment is no longer the expression of growing mastery of the world, you know, the old Descartesian way of doing, becoming the master of nature, but on the contrary, it's the scene of loss of mastery. So the question that we need to answer is what kind of institutions could we build, do we need to reshape human nature metabolism? How should we process knowledge in another way to invest in order to build and dismantle what is not needed? And the main point here is that in complex societies, there are only two ways to totalize this kind of process. Those two instances of totalization are market by finance and planning, which is the political mechanism. Of course, they are never pure in real-world society. There are always combination of them. But there is a dominant form that is leading the process. And the debate that we should have is between those two forms of domination in terms of organizing the totalization of the investment and dismantlement process in the age of the Anthropocene. So the structure of my talk tonight is the following one. First, I will discuss the option of the market, which is green finance. And I will try to convince you, and I suggest, imagine that will not be very difficult, but that's an aporia. But I think it's important to go into the detail of the argument to show how it works in order to be strong on that point. And secondly, I will discuss the possibility of ecological planning, various dimensions of the process. And here I will rely a little on the book that we wrote with Resming and that was published this year. So you have not seen my structure because I was forgetting to follow my slides. So it is. Let's go. So green finance. So the promise of green finance is that we can have capitalism, but just better. And there is a lot of things going on around that. And this is from the NZZ, a Swiss leading newspaper, where you have this kind of advertisement for using your savings. And at the heart of this position, there is, of course, Hayek. Hayek explained that we need to trust individuals. We need to trust individuals since there is, in his view, no more justification in a free society for relieving the individuals of the responsibility of the future than there were for claim past generation that we have to consider for past generation. So basically, we need to rely on individuals to prepare the future. And of course, the key argument for that is that because knowledge is dispersed. This is the crucial argument. Of course, knowledge, in some instance, the government is able to get more knowledge than the people in general. But it's easier to distribute the knowledge to the people in order people to be able to make good decisions than to centralize knowledge that is irreducibly in the hand of the people. So it's not possible for authority to learn all the different facts that are necessary. This is the kind of argument that has been developed by central bankers. And this is from a very famous speech in 2015 by Mark Carney. At that moment, he was the head of the Central Bank of England. And he explained that there is a financial risk linked to climate change. And of course, for central bankers, it's not a problem in itself that you have some kind of market turbulences. However, if there is a whole reassessment of the prospect, you risk to have a kind of pro-cyclical crystallization of losses, which will result in a dramatic financial crisis. And such a dramatic resolution of the tragedy of the horizons is a financial stability risk for central bankers, and they need to care about that. So probably you know about that, but the key argument is the following thing, is that if we are able to invest with foresight, if we have the information to invest correctly, the less we will regret in insight. So his response is that in order to face this risk of financial instability linked to climate change, we need to get the good information. Very Keucheyan. How you can do that? You need to account for climate risk. You have several kinds of risk linked to climate change. Physical risk, of course, if there is a storm, you cannot use anymore your factories, so investors will lose money. There is liability risk. Maybe people will get angry. They will go to court and ask, I don't know, British Petroleum to pay some money to them for the destruction of the environment. And there is also transition risk. Maybe the regulation will change. You will need to change your productive processes, which will result in losses. So this is a kind of risk that you need to know better. So in order to assess this kind of risk, what the financial market needs is they need to have some kind of climate risk disclosure. Companies should inform us about those kind of risk. And at that moment, financial markets will be able to deal with this kind of risk. And this discourse was very influential, at least in Europe. And this is from a paper about the European Central Bank. And it shows on the left that you had more and more discourses that are mentioning climate risk. And this mentioning of climate risk is more and more also related to various aspects of the mandate of the European Central Bank. But the key point here is that how concretely the central bank can contribute to manage this financial risk. The sharpest move that has been made by the ECB is that the ECB changed its portfolio in the sense that it tried to make greener its portfolio. It introduced some climate scores in its evaluation of how it will purchase assets in order to do its monetary policies. So this is the sharpest move that has been made in July 2022. So it's important in one sense, because that means that the ECB is not only concerned by financial stability or inflation, but the ECB is truly concerned, and it mentioned that explicitly, about the fact that you need to stabilize the climate, and it's trying to do that. However, of course, the problem is how it is doing that. And basically, it's guessing. He has no clue to do that. And this is from Eric Monet, that wrote an interesting book about central banking in Europe now. He said that the central bank has no competent staff for studying and choosing investment. It cannot choose assets properly. So what he's doing is the ECB is trying to guess. So it's looking at public available data, it's looking at agencies that are giving marks to companies, and it's trying to make a small combination of that to decide how to allocate its purchases of assets in order to develop its green monetary policy. So it's very weak. It's very, very weak. The main point, however, is that there is no such a thing as green central banking without green assets. So we need to think a little bit more about what will be green assets. For the moment, the ECB is relying on publicly available information, so it lacks the expertise. Maybe it will evolve in the future. There are some discussions at the European level, but I will not dig into the detail now, but I'm relatively skeptical about that. So what kind of assets are they buying? They are buying ESG assets. So that's this social responsibility and environmental responsibility governance, which is transformed into labels that are added to bonds sold by corporations. And that's the way you can incorporate this issue of managing the future through the market process. It's by making some forms of bonds, so from of financial assets that are taking responsibility for the climate risk, the climate future. And we have more and more of this kind of bonds. That's what you can see here. This is very, very Hayekian. So this is the way the Austrians are winning the battle about the climate and the ecology right now. By seeking to create market conditions that are more informed about climate change, disclosure reflects a neoliberal understanding of markets. And in that sense, it's the victory of Friedrich Hayek that is building on the market as an information processor to take into account the climate risk. So this argument, I think, is very important because it means that disclosure of information, it's at the end of the day, the way that you are trying to keep markets as a way to allocate capital according to the green criteria. Why not? If it could save the planet, we will all be happy, I think. We are at this point of disappointment that we will take anything, but that will not occur. That will not occur. Greenwashing, wrong prices, the fallacy of green finance. I will go into a little bit into the detail of the problem. So the first thing is that since the ECB is not knowing what it is doing very bad things. For instance, it is buying a lot of bonds that are in fact favoring land grabbing in Latin America. And this is from the municipality of in the isthmus of Tehuantepec, Keucheyan. And in this municipality, major multinationals are building a lot of facilities to produce green electricity. So you can see that, of course. Too bad. So they are building a lot of facilities to build electricities, and part of those facilities are funded indirectly by the ECB, because the ECB bought for 10 billion bonds of Iberdrola, and Iberdrola is one of the main investors in that sector. Another thing that is very striking is that if you are able to know what people do really at the place, and if they tell you things that are just horrible. This guy was, up to September 2019, the chief investment officer at BlackRock in sustainable investment. And he said that his role at BlackRock was to popularize the idea that ESG and sustainability and green products will contribute to the ecological transformation. And what he's saying is that in doing that job, what he's saying is that we need more market in order to be able to resolve that problem. While at the end of the day, the market is a problem. And he's making even a kind of audacious comparison. He says that exactly like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, that explains that you have too much crime linked to guns, so you need more guns to protect people not to have crime with guns. So he's kind of audacious in that. And he's also very harsh, saying that, in fact, BlackRock executives know that they are exaggerating the degree of overlap between purpose and profit. And they are, in fact, actively misleading people. It seems that it's true. This is from Germany now. We are moving. And this person, it's Desiree Fixcler. She was hired in 2020 by this subsidiary of Deutsche Bank to manage ESG in that institution. She was a sustainability officer. And she observed when she arrived that there was a big gap between their public ESG claims and the reality of their ESG effort. So she went to her boss, she discussed with them, and nobody changed nothing. She observed that the statements were just wrong. So she went public. And she went public, and that led to a German policy that tried that place. They were not just lying a little bit. They were lying quite a lot. Just after the operation of the police, they diminished by 75% their ESG assets. So that means that they were telling the truth more or less 1 time in 4, which is not even moderately correct. But there is worse. You can look at green bonds in the US. Green bonds in the US, it's a paper that has been published recently by the NBER, and that is looking at the green part in green bonds in investment between 2014 and 2024. And in fact, they discovered that there is something green, meaning some green additionality, in only 2% of the bonds. So that basically 98% of the bonds are just usual bonds. But they are selling them, because there is a lot of demand, as green bonds. But that's 98% of bullshit rate. I think it's kind of very high. So that's the kind of problem that we have. And that's not the only problem that we have. We also have a problem since, even at a deeper level, the ability of the market process to deal with this transformation is very, very weak. We have a very important book that was published this year by Brett Christophers that explained that the problem that we have is the profit. So he's focusing on electricity generation. And he explained that everybody was thinking that once the high cost of solar panels and wind energy will drastically diminish, at that moment we will be able to have more green energy production. And in fact, now we have cheaper green energy electricity production, but still we are not able to attain those targets. So this is the diminishing cost of production of solar PV and wind energy. So solar PV is the black line, and wind energy is the dot line, but it's right now at the bottom. And so that means that now they are the cheapest way of producing electricity. However, we are still producing more and more electricity using fossil fuels. And this is up to 2022. And on the left, you see that the black line is above the rate of growth of the other lines, which are linked to renewable energy generation. So there is no such a thing as energy decarbonation, in spite of lower cost of generating green energy. So why? The explanation is the profit. Green electricity profitability is elusive. So why? Because we know how to make profit using fossil fuels. It's relatively stable, there are variable costs. However, this new way of producing electricity is very disruptive. And the problem is that there is no guarantee at all for capitalists that they will be able to reap the gains, to make profits by those investments. So technically, there are several dimensions that are important, but significant upfront investments, low barrier to entries, which means a lot of competition, and the kind of cannibalization effects, meaning that when you have a lot of people producing energy in that way, prices are crashing, so nobody will invest anymore. So that's the kind of obstacle that we are facing. And indeed, this is from Shell CEO, explained that he thinks on low carbon. He thinks a lot on low carbon, categorically. However, he cannot justify going for a low return. And if he cannot achieve the double-digit returns in a business, we need to question very hard whether we should continue in that business. So we want to continue to go for lower, lower, and lower carbon. We really want, but it has to be profitable. That's. Finally, we are going back to our guy from BlackRock, because I think he's doing very strong argument. He's also pointing the fact that there is a kind of logical fallacy in this idea of ESG investment. There is no such a thing as doing well by doing good. Why there is no such a thing as doing well by doing good? Because if the advantage of ESG is that you are paying as a corporation, you are making investment in green investment, so you want to produce ESG bonds in order to pay lower interest rates on your debt. So in that case, you have lower debt, very well. But that means that the investors that are providing you some capital will have a lower returns. So lower cost for enterprise to invest in green mean lower returns for investors. There is no other way out there. Which means that if you are doing well, you are not doing good, or the other way around. If you are doing good, not doing well, you have a chance to do good, but not the two at the same time. So I think it's very important, this argument, of course, because logically it doesn't work. The other thing is that maybe you have the same rate of return in green investment and other kind of investment. But in that case, you don't need any kind of ESG labels, because that just means that's the same rate of return. There is another argument that is, I think, even stronger. So this is the greenium. That's the difference between the normal rate on the bonds and the rate on green bonds. So that's for Europe since 2019 up to November 2023. So you see that there is a small premium, meaning that you pay lower your debt if you are using ESG financial products. The problem is that if you are making more money by investing in brown energy, you will have more capital at the end of the day. So if you go into the medium to long term, the capital is accumulating more rapidly in the brown sector than in the green sector, which means that you have a kind of composition dimension, which means that the green part will be lower and lower in the long run than the brown part. So brown investors will get bigger than green investors due to this greenium differential. So I think that we need to put green finance in its place, which means a small place, very small place. So this is from very reasonable people, central bankers. This is a report from 2020 by for the BIS, by people from the Banque de France, including Romain Schwarzman, which is also somebody that is linked a little bit to EP people working on ecological issues. And he said that integration of climate-related risk into prudential regulation by central bank will not suffice. So central banks will not be able, by their own policy, to manage this issue of green capital. And there is a problem. The problem is that there is strong political pressure on central banks to play that role. Exactly the kind of pressure that I mentioned earlier. You have Carney that say that we can do that. You have ESG people that are making a lot of ESG products that want central bank to buy their assets, to support their assets. So there is a lot of pressure on central banks. And they say that such calls are excessive and unfair. Central banks cannot substitute for the many areas of interventions that are necessary. So basically those people are saying that central bankers do not want to take responsibility for the green transformation. Thank you. There are also journalists working for the financial press. This Derek Brower, maybe some of you have heard about that because it was a little bit on social network 1 year ago. He said that capitalism won't deliver the energy transition fast enough. So he thinks that's not possible. And why? Basically because government have to lead that, both for issue of the size of the investments that are necessary, but also the coordination capability that are necessary. Bye. So at the end of the day, I think that we need to agree with another neoliberal, which is Milton Friedman. There is no such a thing as the corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is elusive. If we want to have corporate social responsibility, we need to move to the political mechanism. Yes, that's exactly what we want to do. He made an argument against corporate social responsibility, but I think that we should accept his argument and make the move toward the political mechanism. And in fact, that's because, as William Cab said a long time ago already, valorizations increase ecological social cost. As long as you are mainly relying on private incentives, you are building incentives to externalize the cost. And so if we want to take into account that issue, we need to have other mechanisms. So that brings me to the second part of my talk, which is that if we cannot rely on capital markets to manage the green transformation, to take into account the knowledge that is necessary to transform our economy, the structure of our economy, then we need to think about another device, which is ecological planning. One argument, of course, and I think that we need to use that, is that the debate about information changed. Part of the debate was about dispersed knowledge, as said by Hayek, but however, that dispersed knowledge is much more accessible, even if it is not completely accessible nowadays. And this is also linked to the fact that our society dramatically transformed. This is an argument from Ernest Mandel that insists on the fact that planning is more and more and more present in our societies. Corporations are bigger, bigger, and bigger. Work is more and more divided. Socialization of labor is more and more important. So just not acknowledging that fact is just not acknowledging the fact that we have the possibility to plan. In fact, private capitalists are doing that a lot. So this is a key argument. The other argument that we developed, and Cecilia mentioned that earlier today, is the fact that specifically with knowledge monopoly firms, you have a new layer of planning capability that is developing nowadays, not only within corporations, but also beyond corporations, in particular along global value chains. So this socialization of work controlled by corporation is something that we can build on to think about concretely plan our economies. And this argument, in fact, was mentioned a long time ago by Scholz-Wäckerle. So this is Scholz-Wäckerle. He's a French economist. He was a specialist on planning issue. And he said that he was basically thinking about Cuba, about India, about the Soviet Union, China, and trying to see how those countries could develop at that moment. And he said, you can plan, of course, but don't be too optimistic. It will be difficult. Why? Because the economy is very dispersed. You have a low means of controlling the information, of gathering that. So your planning ambitions should be limited to the information that you have. And it's not enough to just nationalize property. It's not enough to have a formal administrative planning authority. You need to have the technical means to gather the information, to treat the information, to transmit the information. So the key sentence here is, of course, that the determination of the economic subject, so the ability to plan properly, depends on the possibilities to transmit information, to memorize information, and to process information. And this, as those advances in the sphere of information techniques, will have considerable practical consequences for planning. Well, we are not in the same condition that you were in Cuba in 1960. So I think that's something that we need to take into account about the possibilities of planning. And yet, you have big tech in China that say, planning is coming back very rapidly and very strongly. This is from Jack Ma, from Alibaba. He said that in the past 100 years, more and more we were thinking about the market as the main way to organize the economy. However, he thinks that there will be some significant changes. Why? Because thanks to algorithm, computers will be able to find the invisible end of the markets. And these new perceptions of the world that we are gathering will allow you to plan and to predict market forces so as to allow us to finally achieve a planned economy. So what do you think? So it's ambivalent. We are happy on the one hand because, you know, it's very powerful and he's saying that planning will occur. But on the other hand, he's also not exactly our crowd, I would say. And his argument is also a bit frightening. So something that, yes, and that's the argument of people like Paul Keucheyan, who is for a very long time arguing in favor of this kind of algorithmic planning. So thanks to computer, we will be able to gather the knowledge and to optimize the organization. And he's building on Kantorovich and saying that if you have a finite number of techniques, if you have a pre-given vector of resources, so you know what you have, at that moment you will be able to optimize the planning process. And he developed an algorithm to do that. And he even calculated how much computer power would be necessary to do that in China. And he said that, yes, we can do that. So he said, I have the algorithm, Jack Ma, you have the power, let's plan the Chinese economy in my way. So in his view, the computational part of the knowledge problem is solved. But you know, we have a problem. We have the Austrians. And the Austrians, they don't agree. They say that there is no such a thing as techno-socialism. Why? Because the market is not the data. Information in the market is not data. It's the fact that people are really engaging in transaction, really engaging in exchange. And that depends on knowledge that is on the spot, that is dispersed, that cannot be formalized. So whatever the computer power, you will not be able to plan. There is no such a thing as a feasible principle for techno-socialism. And I think that there is other people that are also Austrian. A woman, I think, Sylvia Reif. I'm not sure she's Austrian, but she's working here. And she said that it depends. That could be useful. That could be useful, but that will not be sufficient. Data analytics by itself, if divorced from the reorganization of economic institutions, and from critical analysis of techno-scientific objectification and commodification, does not automatically equal to socialist or emancipatory project. I think that's a good way to phrase that. It will be useful, it could be useful for planning to mobilize this kind of computerized power. However, it will not be enough. We cannot just rely on algorithm. So we are going back to this old knowledge problem, the problem of the varieties of knowledge. And this is a kind of very rapid summary of the argument. We have basically three positions. On the left side, you have people that think that the market is an efficient process and that computer can mimic the market. So you have the price system, you have centralization, and then either you have the market or you have computer, but you will be able to resolve the equations and to have this kind of technical optimization via computer. In less than a second, that could be very rapid, told us Oscar Lange in 1967. And you have Hayek that, of course, do not agree on that. Yes, thank you. So you have Hayek that, of course, do not agree on that. And Hayek, what he's saying is that it's not possible to gather the information. We have already seen that. But we have also a third position. And you know what? It's a kind of Austrian, a nice Austrian. It's our dear Otto Neurath. So Otto Neurath is saying basically that you have some forms of political truth that could be built and that we can have some forms of planning, but we need to rely on deliberation. And what is very interesting with Neurath is that on the one hand, he's very keen of Hayek. He said that he wants to over-Hayek Hayek, in the sense that he is the sworn enemy of the illusion of complete knowledge. So the cockshot computer planning, it's not really stuff at all. He doesn't believe in that. And I think he's right. But in the meantime, he's also considering that Hayek is only telling part of the truth. If it is true that a lot of knowledge cannot be centralized, there are also a lot of knowledge that cannot be decentralized. And I think that's very important, this argument. When we think about the Anthropocene and all the complexities of the Earth system, we need to manage that. We do not have the choice. It must be managed. However, it's not possible for each of us to get the information relevant, to take the good action to deal with that. It cannot be dispersed. So we have this tension between irreducible dispersal of knowledge, but also centralization and impossible dispersal of some forms of knowledge. So planning is a battlefield. Planning is a battlefield between the democratic moment, where we need a super strong legitimacy, because planning is about long-term processes, so we need to deliberate, we cannot change our mind every day. We need to have a multi-criteria approach, because it's in value. That's where, when you are making long-term choice as a society, it's in value choices that you are doing. And this very idea of planning implies, this is from Leontiev, which was also a key thinker about planning techniques and that obtained the Nobel Prize in the 70s. He said that the very idea of planning implies the possibility of choosing between several possible scenarios. And I think that this sentence is really the core of the problem. Possibility of choosing, that means that you will have some forms of deliberation, you will value the various options, you will decide that by discussing, basically. That's a truly political process. But the other part of the discussion, it's about possible scenarios. And possible scenario, it's technical, it's feasibility. It's a key concept, feasibility, but that means that everything is not possible. And so we will discuss in that frame. And the way that Neurite summarized the problem is that we have a constant battle between the expert, the technique, and ordinary people. This is the process of democratic planning, a battle between expertise, technique, and the democratic process. So for the end of my presentation, I will rely on some of the arguments that we developed in this book with Resming. So there are many arguments. It's a book, it's long. So I will not consider all of them. I will not discuss the more political part, institutional part of what we call augmented democracy, and that basically proposed to follow a federalist approach. I will not discuss also something that is after the moment of planning, that is the shorter term when we are consumer could be much more powerful, much more conscious about their action. They could also act collectively. So we are making some reflection on that. But I will focus on 3 dimensions that are key for planning in relation to the investment process that was mentioned already earlier today and that I will discuss also a little bit more. Those 3 key institutions, 3 key planning devices are ecological accounting, the matrix calculation of lifestyles, and the socialization of investment. So ecological accounting is something that is very much discussed today. There are a lot of discussion in various circles at the national level among accountants in private firms, but also at the UN level. And for private firms, what is being chosen now, it's this framework. And this framework is from the IFRS, which is the main institutions in charge of normating the reporting by corporations. They say that they need to incorporate better the social dimension, the ecological dimension in the accounting of firms. And they propose a way to do that. But the key thing is that they are not really departing from the argument of CAP, that in fact they are just trying to externalize the social cost. Because when you look into the details, they explain that the value of an organization creates for others, so the environment, the populations, the workers, will be taken into account when it affects the ability of the organization to create value for itself. So you will consider ecological cost, social degradation, negative democratic impact only to the extent that will affect the corporation profitability. So there is that's just a kind of instrumental view of those externalities. And when these interactions, activities, and relationships are material to the organization's ability to create value for itself, to make profit, they are included in the integrated report. So that means that if you're able to pollute or to violate human rights, but you are sure that will not lower your profit, you don't need to report that on your account. So I think it's a very low bar. But that's the norm now. That's the norm that is being developed for corporations. I think that we can do better. And we can do better because we do not have necessarily to rely on corporation. So here, that's something that is very ambivalent. There are many satellites in the sky, too much. And we know that that will destroy our ability to enjoy the sky, that it will be more and more hard to see the stars in the sky. There are only, Elon Musk is supposed to send about 30,000 satellites in the sky in the next 15 years. So that's, a huge number of satellites. And it's spiking very rapidly due to this kind of constellations that they are building. So SpaceX, Amazon via Kuiper, but also China is doing that, and European has a Copernicus program too. However, with those satellites, we are also able to know things that we do not know otherwise. For instance, there is a corporation linked to Google, by the way, which is Planet Labs, which is also connected to Amazon. You can use their product on Amazon, that is making imagery of the whole planet every day. Every day you have at least one photo of every piece on the planet, and you can see a car. So that's kind of relatively detailed kind of photography. So with this kind of information, you can do a lot of things in order to manage the environment, be aware of what's going on on your planet. And in fact, there are some corporations that are doing things that I think are very interesting, much more relevant, I think, than the information that will give us the IFRS people. So this firm, Kairos, is using those kind of data that I mentioned earlier, but from European data there, to make theory in real time of energy uses at the planet level. So both the production of energy, the storage of energy, and the use of energy at the planet level. So they are continuously assessing what kind of energy and consumption and storage is taking place at the planetary level. But they also show interesting things. So if you want to plan, of course, that's crucial. With this kind of information, you can think a lot about a lot of elements. But what they're also showing is that you are able to manage things that otherwise you will not be able to manage. For instance, they show that between 3 and 10 times more methanes are emitted than what is declared by corporations. So they are just lying if they can. So if you have the way to observe that, you will need to rely on that. And I think that to plan, that's something that's important that we need to mobilize. So I will not go into the detail of that, but that's the kind of things that we need to think about. We need to build a permanent inventory of nature. A permanent inventory of nature, that means that we need to count birds, we need to count flowers, we need to count gas emissions, we need to count pollutant, and we need to count as much as we can. And we will not be able to count everything, of course, but we are already able to count a lot of things. If we are not doing that, we will not be able to manage this ecological transformation. So that's the very basic. You can do that at the macro level. I think that's very important. But we also know, and that's something that we are very aware of, that a lot of things also are not seen at the macro level. That's for Scott and for Hayek. We need to analyze them for them. So that means that you need also to have a way to account at the local level. So that's, you can think about commons built around ecosystems that will be able to account for what's taking place locally. But those accounting at the macro level, via satellite and stuff like that, and at the micro level, through commons management of ecosystems, need to be connected if you want to be able to have robust data and to properly take into account the impact on economic activities on planetary boundaries. So, first institutions, ecological accounting. Without ecological accounting, we can end the conversation now. You can talk about investment, whatever. If you are not able to have an idea, concrete idea of what's taking place, you are not going nowhere. Second, key institutions, the matrix calculation of lifestyles. So that's basically building scenarios. But building these scenarios necessitate to have some forms of tools to do that. So among the good news is that the idea of planning is not marginal anymore. This is from a report, Pisani-Marfou's report, that was written for the French Prime Minister last year. And they explain that planning, sector by sector, but that planning is the best way to achieve climate goals. You can rely on carbon pricing. It's not sure that will be accepted. You know, the yellow vest was a kind of nice moment, political moment in France. But anyhow, they consider that the credibility of this kind of measure is low. And the fact is that, in spite of the fact that carbon price is the leading instrument from the mainstream economic point of view, it's less and less used as a key political device by policymakers now. There is a kind of mismatch between economics and policymaking on that point. Another way to implement a climate strategy is to provide incentives to distribute money, but to buy electric cars and stuff like that. But there is no direct link between the target and the instrument, and they doubt the effect of that. They consider that the only way, the consistent way, I think consistency is the main thing that we want, to be consistent between your objectives and what you are doing. The consistency with a quantitative target, it's only planning that can deliver that to you. So I think that's very interesting. And they are also explaining how you do that. You need to calculate that, of course, rationally, to look at where it's less expensive to reduce emissions than other way. But on the basis of this calculation, you will use regulatory tools, and you can also rely on credit allocation. And I think that's something also very important, credit allocation to develop that. But I think that's not enough to think about planning sector by sector at the industry level. What we need to think about is not only having cars that are less pollutant. We need to think about the way we will move in the city and between countries. That's the kind of discussion that we should discuss. So that's basically building scenario. That's thinking about lifestyles. And this guy, Bogdanov, wrote in a paper in a discourse to Soviet trade unions in 1921, the basic principles of the input-output matrix, the way to think about the link between the various branches of the economy and the output that you have. And there are few principles, but they are absolutely crucial. One principle is the principle of intersectoral chaining. The various sectors are linked one another. The second thing is that if you want to plan something, you need to look at the weakest point. And on these two principles, you can build scenarios. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to build scenarios and to be aware of where are the weak points, how we can deal with those weak points. So the space of possible scenarios is this kind of matrix calculation, and it's a precondition of a democratic deliberative exercise. If we are not able to have this kind of instruments, there is no possibility to make choice. You cannot make a choice without having a scenario that is realistic. So we need this kind of instrument to make those choices. And this kind of instrument should be able to articulate in natural calculations and economic cost-based calculations. So I think it's very important, and there are a lot of research right now. For instance, there is this paper by Julien Lefebvre from the CIRED in France that is trying to making an assessment of the input-output models that we have and how they can work and incorporate, articulate both in natural calculation and more economic variables. So that's something that is absolutely decisive. So the second institutions that we need, this second institution that we need is institution concerning our ability to build scenarios based on input-output analysis and articulating in natural ecological dimension with economic dimensions. Finally, the third institution that we need, of course, is the socialization of investment. You can count nature in order to assess what we are doing. You can build scenarios, but if you have no lever to implement the consequence of your deliberation, there is no point in the exercise. So socialization of investment is crucial. And this has been discussed today around Keynes by Aaron Sooner, and I think that is very important. Keynes was not only, when he was arguing in favor of socialization of investment, he was not only arguing in favor of full employment. He was also looking at the level of choosing between various branches of the economy to develop. Selecting, overseeing, coordinating, this is the kind of job that a board of national of investment should be doing. And in fact, that's not very socialist. This is from a Liberal Party British report on 1928. How times are changing now. What that means in the Anthropocene, this idea of socializing investment. That means that we need to invest, but without this idea of productivism, which helped to build consensus in the previous era. So that's a big change, of course. And our key, of course, criteria should be strong sustainability, the ability to provide for the subsequent generations a livable planet. The second thing that we need to think about is that we not only have to build a new clean infrastructure, but we also need to pay for the dismantling of the old polluting infrastructures. Which means that at least in the short run, we will have an investment push. We need to invest a lot, invest in clean, and invest a lot just to dismantle what needs to be dismantled. And the third dimension that was also not considered at all by Keynes is the issue of democracy, and I think that Aaron also mentioned that today earlier. Something else that I think that we can think about is the place of producer in that process of planning. Because I was mostly discussing at the macro level or at the level of the people, society at large, something like that. But what is the place of producer into that? If we look at history, there is of course a big tension. In some cases, like of course neoliberalism, socialization of investment is very reduced. It exists. The state is investing in Austria, in France, in the UK, in the US, so there are some forms of public investment. There are also some norms on investment. Capitalists cannot invest completely freely, at least up till now. With Musk now in the US, they will have a much more opportunity to choose where they invest, but still they have some constraint. But in general, in our society, there is a very limited socialization of investment. It's very reduced. In Sweden, you had a lot of socialization of investment. You had this minor plan. The plan, it did not attain its objective, but the process was launched. Its objective was to build a purely non-capitalist ownership of firms. So there was a mechanism, and year by year, the workers will reap the profit and will buy the share of company, and at the end of the day, you will not have any more capitalists, only workers-owned corporation. But in that plan, you do not have any forms of socialization of investment. It's still the workers that will decide investment, but at the firm level. So there is a lot of worker participation, but no macro decision concerning investment. If you're thinking about macro decision concerning investment, cross-sector socialization, or investment according to lifestyle, if you want, you need to look at developmentalism. Developmentalism, it's what took place in South Korea, in France, after World War II, in the Soviet Union to some extent. But in all those experiments, you have this very high hierarchical mechanism, low democracy, a lot of technocracy, a lot of brutality in some cases. Some cases were more democratic than others, a little bit in France, a little bit in Latin America to some extent. There was participation of unions in some cases, but it was generally not very democratic. And we could have maybe something in Chile, where you had this idea of associating both a national discussion concerning planning, but also a democratic participation of workers. But you know that Pinochet stopped that experience. Still, socialization of investment is absolutely the key dimension to plan. Without socialization of investment, there is no planning at all. And I think that Michel Husson, who is a French economist that wrote about planning in 1991, so the guy, bravo Michel Husson, that's at the moment when nobody is talking about planning at all. So he wrote on planning at that moment. It was a short paper about 22 points in defense of planning. What is the very idea of planning? And he said that at the end of the day, it's to have another filter when we discuss investment. In capitalism, capitalism interposes a filter between social needs and what is produced. And this filter, of course, is profitability. Instead of that, he thinks that we need to control this eminently social function of investment, and we need to replace the filter of profitability by the filter of democracy, according to the decision concerning planning. So, controlling the means of planning of investment is basically, socializing investment is basically planning. So it's very broad, but what it is concretely to invest? It's basically four things. The first thing is nationalization. All planning experiments rely on big public firms, infrastructures, railways, big banks, big enterprises of constructions. They need to be public capitals. That's the strategic height of the economy, like the Chinese said, but Lenin said the same. Second thing is credit policy. Credit policy is crucial because credit policy, it allows you to decide in which kind of area you want to plan. No, there is no there. So I don't know how to go back, but It's okay. Thank you. So credit policy is very important because credit policy is a way to decide the direction where you want to invest without deciding concretely which kind of technology, which kind of solution you will implement, which gives some space for innovations, for entrepreneurship, for various forms of cooperation. So I think it's very important to have a kind of dynamic economy. And here, of course, that means that you have also market mechanism. You can deliberate about the direction of where investment will take place, but after, people will decide on the market which kind of product they want. But at least the broad direction of development will be decided by this public control of investment. You can have also a new way to manage assets in a complex economy like us. Solia Omarova, in a workshop that was organized recently, developed this idea of public asset management, a kind of BlackRock, or better, Blackstone, managed by the public. So you can decide to support some innovative sectors, to take risk and so on, so you have a kind of public management in a more subtle manner than just credit policy, but that still with strategic capabilities in the hand of public authorities. What is crucial is if you really want to socialize investment, that means that you have a high level of taxation and profit. If firms are able to accumulate profit and invest, in that case, in the time, your capability to control investment will just disappear. So all those instruments are very nice, but they have also a more harsh dimension. That means that most of profits need to be centralized. And finally, you have another device that is very important. It's public services. Education, healthcare, maybe a new public service of repairing. This kind of things is a way also to socialize investment and to deploy new forms of activities. So I'm moving to the conclusion now. And I would like to have a kind of moderate approach vis-à-vis what I mentioned earlier. I think that we conceded too much to the Austrian, but however, we still need to find a kind of middle way between centralization of knowledge and dispersion of knowledge. And in order to think about that, I propose you to make a small tour with French philosophy using this Roland Barthes text, Living Together. And in this text, Roland Barthes is fantasizing about a way of living, a lifestyle that will be neither reclusive nor communal. If you want to be alone, but without solitude, something that would be nice, no? So you don't have to support the rhythm of others, to adapt to the rhythm of others, but in the meantime, you will be able to enjoy sociability. And of course, everybody wants that, but how to do that? And the whole course is about looking at the various experiments of communal life with more or less space for the individuals. And he was thinking about a utopia of a socialism of a distance, a kind of very subtle interplay between individuals and the collective that will allow each to escape the diktat of heterorhythmy, so the diktat of the rhythm of others. I think that we need to think of our problem of planning and dispersion of knowledge a little bit in the same way. You have on the one hand degrowth communism by Keynote, for example. But that's an argument that is, to some extent echoes the argument of Hayek or of Scott. What he's saying that it's there is a socialization in capitalism, but also in techniques that is reifying individual lives and that is reifying nature. And in this process, we have, to some extent, not able to imagine a new way of life. Productive forces of capital cannot be properly transferred to post-capitalism. It's not enough to have a state to control the technology to build an eco-socialist society. It's not possible. If you want a completely different lifestyle, you need to downscale production. Why you need to downscale production? His argument is not mostly about diminishing the impact on the environment. It is that, of course, but it's also that you will be able to rebuild new form, new kind of technology. And on the other hand, on the other side, you have the argument of eco-modernists like Matt Huber that say that those degrowth people are just proposing to begin to start from scratch, and that it's a fact. In fact, it's a distraction. What we need is the ability to control the productions, the forces of productions. We need to overcome the anarchy of the market. We need a strong state to govern the economy. And at that moment, we will be able to face the ecological crisis. I think that we need to find a narrow path between the two positions, a sort of tempered rationalism, in the sense that it's true, and I'm 100% with Keucheyan, and to some extent with Hayek and with Scott too. There are reification forces that are very strong and that are linked to the productive power of socialization. It could be the market, it could be the state. There are some forms of reification that are at stake here. However, we need those productive forces that are reifying our lives if we want to be able to sustain some kind of relatively, if we want to benefit from the advantages of socializing labor. However, we can accept those reification forces, in my view, only to the extent that we have some check and balances, some forms of democratical way to control those forces. In the meantime, we should contain those forces. We should limit them. We should not rely only on this kind of forms. We need to build space for activity, autonomous activities. We need to contain that risk. And contain that reach of socialization is the way to preserve both individual autonomy, but also nature, non-identity. The fact that we will not be able ever to control completely nature. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cédric, for this very stimulating and thought-provoking talk. I guess there are plenty of questions here in the audience. We take 4 questions. Can you digest 4 questions? 4 questions, pack them, and then go forward.
So I think you said it in your talk. Thank you for the talk. The most difficult part is how do we choose democratically between the scenarios? So I was expecting another chapter like the last one to be on this. Could you talk a bit more about this central part? Like what is the democratic mechanism once we have this matrix, the accounting, to make democratic decisions?
Thank you. You got a question? You got it?
Yeah, I got it.
Good.
In that matrix of countries that you had, I'm curious where you would place Yugoslavia and the way that was organized.
Yes, thank you very much. Just one question. At the end, you used the concept reification, right? And then we need to maintain some reification. This reification comes from Lukács, and then, but reification means actually that reification exists if there is a totalized capitalist market, and that's reification. So how you are going to have that? So in case you have some explanation on this, I will be more than grateful because I'm delighted to see this.
We could pick one more question. Jakob.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, so with regards to ecological accounting, I think would be like to get more deeper into the problems, to ask really what kind of positive aspects also like monetary calculation has. For example, that not true that we should have it, but only acknowledging that it condenses everything to like a single indicator, and with these multidimensional indicators, we don't have this like simple, smooth commensurability that we shouldn't have because we have all the externalities and all this. But how do we deal with this? How can we have an accounting that is at the same time multidimensional and has this accounting identity and commensurability we have in the price system? I think we need to get deeper into these contradictions. Maybe you have some thoughts on this.
Let's take these 4 questions, then we have another round. I remember
There are 3.
Okay, that would be directly to it, then we take it, of course.
Just to add on this, that okay, maybe it's not like one unit like money, and maybe not 1,000 units like all the ecological flows we have, but maybe a compromise. So let's say we can go to a certain abstraction of maybe that's what actually we will propose, to have 3 main categories, CO2, resources, and working time, which entail 100 indicators each, or 1,000. But to have something like a compromise of, let's say, 3 abstract but very concrete dimensions.
Okay, I noted 3 questions. The second one I forgot, but it will be repeated. It was your question that was? Yugoslavia, yeah. I begin by that, sorry. In the middle. So that will be not, there are some forms of worker participation that are important, but the level of socialization is relatively limited due to that, but it's still relatively significant, so it's some kind of compromise, I would say. So the questions about how we decide between scenarios, I think it's very important. And in the book, we really work a lot on this idea of democratic redundancies in order to have something that is robust from the democratic point of view. Basically, our hypothesis is that people don't believe us when we say that it will be democratic. So we need to double down on the argument that how it will be democratic. And what we propose is a kind of federalist way to deal with democracy. So you have a first element that is very important, the federalism, meaning that you have 2 advantages on that. The first thing is that you have a more direct connection between people and decision for a lot of dimensions. And the second thing is that you have also a kind of dispersion or diversities of solutions that are taken to the same kind of problem that will be decided at the level of scenario. If at the level of the scenario you have a specific target, you can have various ways to do that in various parts of the country. So that's the second element that is important. But there is also a third element, is that in a federation you have a hierarchical dimension. The center is able to impose some dimension, some decision in some dimensions, and we are keeping that. So it's still important to have a democratic way to control the center. Here we are proposing a 3-layer way of activating democracy. One thing is direct democracy. I'm in Switzerland for 4 years, and I discovered that, in fact, that exists direct democracy. You can make big decisions at the level of a country, and people just vote and take decisions. So that exists. First thing, direct democracy. Second things, and that they are not exclusive, they need to add on. The second thing, and it's especially important if you want to discuss about scenario, because discussing scenario is something that is very complex, that is taking a lot of time. And here, I think that we need to think more about a qualitative democracy than a quantitative democracy. So that's the idea of panel, You regroup citizens that represent the diversity of a society, you put them 2 months working with experts, and they build the scenario. They have to build the scenario. They build the scenario. And then there will be a more general discussion. But this elaboration cannot be made by everybody, so you need to delegate that, but not necessarily to do that by professional politicians. It's better to have proper citizens. And in fact, here we can rely on the experiment in France. You had this kind of device after the yellow vest. And it was quite successful. Macron didn't implement almost none of the decisions that were taken, but most of the decisions that were proposed were very good. So in fact, people, when they have the time to discuss, they are taking good decisions. And the third moment is just parliamentary democracy. The plan will be voted by the parliament. There is a kind of usual representative way to validate the proposals. And I think that this way of articulating these 3 dimensions of the democratic process are crucial in order to control the investment function in a proper way. And that will be my answer. So the third question was about reification. I'm not a specialist of Lukács, but here what I mean is just the fact that the more you are mounting in abstraction, the less you have knowledge of the complexity of the real world. And be it through technocratic procedures or through the market process, this process of objectivation of the world is impoverishing it, impoverishing the way we relate to nature, impoverishing the sense of life. And so we need to protect this layer of true life from those processes of objectivation, be it technological or market. So that's what I had in mind. The third question was about accounting. So accounting, I think, is indeed very important. And what the main offensive of the mainstream is to say that we need to account for services that are provided by nature. So how much do you value to have clear water in a lake? How much will you value to have fresh air? How much will you value this landscape, and so on and so forth? And I think that, of course, it's very problematic because it means that you can exchange one bird in exchange of one plant, one landscape in exchange of some water, while nature is incommensurable. All those dimensions have value in themselves, and even more, they are also very often complementaries. So I think that's not the good direction to go. However, you're perfectly right, the fact that we need to have a criteria allowing organization to operate. At the micro level, I think that's very important, in fact, to define a space, an ecological space, that organizations should respect. So you define that space. Experts, citizens decide how much biodiversity, what kind of levels of pollution you tolerate, blah, 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 blah. Once you have defined that space, then you can incorporate economic accounting, meaning that you need to account how much it costs to preserve that ecological space. That's what, in fact, is proposed by this CARE methodology that I mentioned now. That's a kind of accounting methodology that has been developed recently. And they propose to account for the cost of protecting the environment. So what is first is the qualitative in natura calculation of the environment, this ecological space, and then you account how much it costs to preserve that. And I think that's very good because that gives you a criteria of viability for organization. Are they able to pay for that cost, or are they not able to pay for that cost? If they are not able to pay for that cost, they cannot operate. You have a clear criteria that is reduced to one dimension, in spite of the fact that they need to take into account various dimensions. Yeah, the cost is in money. How much work it costs more to preserve a river, how much cost it costs more to have a new, cleaner equipment. That's exactly that. And I think that's, your question was a little bit different concerning the fact that we can reduce complexities in various dimensions. So that's another kind of answer. I have no strong view on that. Why not? But I think that the key concept, in my view, if you think at the macro level and then going at the micro level, is to define this ecological, multidimensional space and propose actors to intervene in that space. But the calculation of that space is main at first. That's also the logical presentation that I proposed. First ecological accounting, then scenarios. That's also the way it goes in my view. Thanks for those questions.
We have a second round of questions. We have Clive here.
Yeah, well, it actually follows on from what we were just discussing in terms of this cost, because I find this really quite worrying. Costs are endogenous. They're not exogenous. They're not. So when you make your decision about your environmental space, you've already affected the cost. So why do you even need to talk about cost? Why don't you just commit resources? If you're talking about a planned economy, why do you have to involve costs? Where are the costs coming from? The marketplace? What? So it seems to be that you've got a circular issue and you have a problem when you start appealing to costs. You got rid of them for the in natura. Why did you do that? Costs are no different than benefits. They're just the other side of the coin.
Yes, I have a question which was posted online from Tiago Lopez, and he asked, where's China in your matrix of socialization and of investment and workers' participation?
Christoph?
Sort of a question, sort of a comment. I thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. A bit overwhelmed with thoughts, but I'm trying to grasp where Hayek and Scott and dispersed knowledge and tacit knowledge all fit in, because the dispersed knowledge doesn't seem to be that problematic with the digital technology. It seems to be more that it's embodied and tacit knowledge, but I think that came up later. So I'm trying to do, this is a question of understanding of where you stand on this. I really liked this idea of Neurath out-Austrianing the Austrians. I thought it was really funny, but also really insightful. I was wondering, whether there's two more fruitful ways of doing this with your work, with what you were presenting, and then not falling into the market planning binary that Hayek strategically opens. One would be the way Pat Devine is doing it, and arguing that following the Austrians and saying, if you argue for this tacit knowledge, well, what about the tacit knowledge of this worker on the assembly line, and by this worker who doesn't have capital and cannot follow his or her their entrepreneurial intuitions and so on. So maybe kind of inversing the argument there, which is kind of what I think Scott was doing when he was criticized for this being this anti-communist book and this anti-planning book, when he said, no, I think this is also about capitalist corporations historically. Those are the planners. They also have all of those problems. This large-scale corporate planning also has all those tacit knowledge problems. And there I think, first of all, it becomes legible that it's not markets planning. It's more central, decentral, and how they go together. Wanted to say something else. Forgot. Don't want to hijack too much time. Sorry.
One more by Nora.
Yeah, thank you. It actually fits very well with what Christoph just said, because Cecilia earlier made this very good distinction between like central planning being possible in a corporate context. So like corporates obviously does have a power of planning centrally big parts of the economy. And then in contrast, like how to do it democratically, or like how can we take the power out of the equation would maybe be my question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That are important questions. So maybe just first on the cost. There are very often these remarks that is made, but I don't understand it. You have a multidimensional definition of an ecosystem where there are some levels of pollutants, there are some levels of biodiversity, and so on and so forth. And for your firms, they need to respect that. So that they need to be able to account for, to pay for the respect of those that ecological space. If they are not able to pay that, the ecological cost of protecting the environment will put them out of the market. So I think that's the idea. And that's also a way to, accounting for this ecological cost is also a way to have a policy instrument. You can decide, well, this activity is absolutely crucial for us, but it will cost that to protect, and so you can have a socialization maybe to deal with that specific dimensions. But accounting the cost of protecting nature is not the same thing as accounting a service provided by nature. I think it's not identical. In particular, why? Because you have this locality, multidimensionality. You are not in one dimension. You are not comparing everything. So you have a constraint, and you see that. But yeah, that's an important discussion. But I think the key things that give you criteria to decide what can be done and what cannot be done. The second question was about China. And China will be, in my view, close to France, South Korea, so meaning that it will be France in the post-war era. So that means that it will be in the right-hand corner, but not too far in terms of socialization, because it's kind of moderate. It's more than liberal economy, but less than it was in developmentalist states, I would say. By the way, the matrix is probably, it would be better to have a map than a matrix. It would be allowed to put Yugoslavia to have more subtleties. So the question of Christoph concerning knowledge, tacit knowledge, dispersed knowledge, and also the question concerning the power of big tech. I'm not sure I got all the aspects of the argument and we can follow up, but as far as I understood, and considering the case of Scott, I think that you're right about Scott. Scott was also against corporations, but in fact, he was not. It was against big corporations, because there is an interview in the Cato Institute where he said that basically small corporations could do a good job in order to allow to have local knowledge used, while big corporations cannot do that. So that's a nuance, I would say, with Hayek, not a strong opposition. Concerning however, there is also this discussion concerning tacit knowledge and dispersed knowledge. And the core of the argument of Hayek was more on dispersed knowledge than tacit knowledge. So what he was saying, Hayek, basically, is that the man on the spot knew better demand and supply and the opportunities to do businesses than do people that can ever know central planners, which is not really the case. The argument concerning the tacit knowledge was more developed by Polanyi, Michael Polanyi, and then after that words incorporated by Hayek. But that's, and I think that we are much more on the second part of the argument. Tacit knowledge is important for us. However, knowledge on the spot of market matrix, in fact, with the data, we can have them right now, I think. Which brings me to your argument. And I think that what can we do with big tech in terms of planning? And I think a big part of the discussion could be related to what Cecilia said earlier about a public stack. If we have the ability to have a public infrastructure to provide big data services that could be mobilized both by firm but also by administrative apparatus, we will have the ability to mobilize this kind of things. The big thing is how can you do that? So part of that is by building the science for that. I think it's very important. Another part is also sizing capabilities in private firms. The states have been more and more weakened in the course of the past decades by just people moving away from the state to work, to do crucial administrative works, but in the hand of corporations. If you want to have the ability to govern, you will need to be able to retake those capabilities. So that means that you incorporate department of some firms in the public apparatus.
Okay, can we take one more round, Cédric?
Last one, yeah.
Okay. So we have a clear question, Werner?
Yeah, I just have a question about nationalization versus, for instance, collectivization or commonization or whatever you want to call it. But I wonder, do you see it as absolutely necessary or optimal that the public governance of, let's say, large-scale infrastructure, something like this, pass through the kind of centralized power of the state to affect that governance, or can it be kind of independent from that? In the sense that could you have, for instance, a governance structure which involves some, workers, a board of, let's say, workers and a board of public users, which governs like a resource like a railroad, and then that kind of governance structure negotiates with other governance structures or the state for the allocation of resources, but also the use of their service. Yeah, that's essentially the question.
Well, thank you, Cédric, for a very interesting talk. I have just one question which you haven't really touched upon. Implicitly, I've understood that the kind of the place where you locate that to happen, this ecological planning to be implemented, is kind of the nation state. And then you have talked shortly about the regions and the local level. But basically what we need is to implement it at a global level, if you want. So how do you kind of envision a coordination between states if you assume that this current system of states will continue to exist? So what kind of perhaps also institutions would you envisage that we need in order to kind of facilitate that kind of coordination?
Yeah, thanks. I have also one question regarding Ernst Mandel, and when you mentioned that he said that there would be more, with capitalism progressing, there would be more socialization of work. And I wonder, especially because of like certain views in the climate movement, who would now say that we need to prepare a just collapse. I wonder how you see like the future development of capitalism. Is it, as Ernst Mandel said, that there would be more and more planning, and thus this for me would kind of imply that we could manage the ecological crisis better? Or is it like we have some small islands, or we have to battle against capitalism and like fight against its growth? What is like your view of capitalism?
Good luck.
Yeah, maybe just one last question. I can't read out all the questions in the chat, but I screenshotted them and Cédric will receive them. I will just read out the last question, which was from Cleo. And she asks, how does social justice feature in your proposed democratic planning? For example, how would you address intersectional structures of oppression and extraction that are real in the here and now? How do you propose to use planning to address these if this conceptualization remains focused on analysis of workers, firms, states, etc., and limited attention to structures across levels of analysis? Yeah.
That is absolutely crucial, and it's very much underdeveloped in the book and in the proposal, so that will be, in my view, linked to the democratic processes. And for instance, of course, there are crucial decisions to be made in terms of care, in terms of norm of works, in terms of, and that's not just discussed. It's not that I think it's not important. I didn't discuss because I didn't go into many of the dimensions that are crucial for planning. This dimension of intersectionality, which is in fact which kind of economic democracy you want, and I described a large infrastructure of democratic functioning, but the substance of that infrastructure, the normative stance of that infrastructure, I didn't discuss it. And I think that's exactly where the question fits, and that's something that needs to be addressed. That's normative and that's crucial. The second thing that is not addressed is the issue of ownership, and that was asked concerning nationalization. Would not be better to have a co-op and so on and so forth. I think I'm in favor of a pluralistic forms of ownership. And I think that very small scale production, private, it's better. Peasants, there is no point of having huge kolkhozs. It's not better to deal with agriculture. So typically these kind of things. On the other hand, cooperative probably are much better in many dimensions. Concerning the railway industry, I think it's okay that the railway worker could participate in the decision, but I think that most of the decision could be really decided politically, because it won't be decided by the market. Consumers have no market power. So here I'm very much in favor of some forms of legitimate administrators that contribute to the decision on that level. So pluralist forms of ownership will be my answer, but I think that, again, it's something that needs to be discussed much more than I discussed. It's a little bit at the fringe of my talk. Scales. So it's the hard questions, of course, but I think that we can let that to the Austrians. And once they decided in between them, we, the rest of the world, will follow and imitate them. So what I want to say here is that I don't think that planning at the world scale level is something that we can think about. There is no way to think about that concretely. However, I think that what we are experimenting with the Anthropocene is something that is of terrific dimension, which means that there is no society that will not be forced to adapt one way or another to that and to invent new institutions. So I think that various countries will go ahead. Some will invent the institutions that will be imitated, transformed, hybridated, but that's the way we can think about enlarging planning processes. So imitation will be my first guess as a way to generalize that. Of course, there are also, it's very general. We can imagine some forms of planning at the global or at the continental scales. If you are focusing on a specific thing, think about greenhouse emissions. You can have objects that are negotiating at the global scale. We know that. It's not sufficient, blah, 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 but we can have this kind of process. But still, socializing investment, for the moment, it's thinkable at the national or subnational scales, maybe in some cases at the continental scale, like in Europe, but to a limited extent. I think I also... capitalism, yeah. I don't know why I forgot that. So I will not guess about the possibilities of collapse, and I will not try to say that. And I think that it's a conversation that is not very fruitful, maybe at the individual level, but at the collective level, collapse, I don't know what we can do with collapse. However, I think that there are some ways to think about other possibilities, some potentialities that are under discussed today. You were mentioning, Manuel, the fact that we are not considering planning as a, generally people are not considering planning as a true concrete possibility today, in spite of the fact that concretely the economy has never been as planned as it is today. And I think that's just something very important to remark. The other thing is an argument that has been made by Göran Sörnborn, who is a Swedish sociologist. And he said that, in fact, we are living in an age of progress. Okay, we have Trump, wars, it's kind of, but what he wants to say is, he wants to say that nowadays we are more and more aware of what is occurring to us as a species at the scale of the planet. We are more aware of wars all around the world. We are more aware of epidemics. We are more aware of destruction of the environment. We are more aware of human rights violations. All of that elements are contributing to the formation of the human consciousness, and that will provide an ability to act as a species. We are very far from that, but we have never been that close at the level of the history. So there are some space for new forms of agency, I think.
Yeah. Great stuff. Thank you very much. Super interesting keynote. Thank you very much for your very good questions and comments. We will close the session today. So there is another keynote tomorrow by Attila Melek, who stands at the back of the room here. We start at 9 o'clock sharp. So please join us 10 minutes at least in advance. Let's say 15. That would be great. And then we have a panel discussion at 5:30, which shall also be very, very interesting. So come by and join us. Something else?
Yep. Also, there will be coffee, so arriving early, you get free coffee tomorrow morning. And for all the speakers and moderators.